started. It's nice to see so many of you back today. This is day 2 of our symposium on Caribbean history and anthropology in the archives. We began last night with a wonderful lecture by Sidney Mintz, and we continued today with 3 panels. As I explained yesterday, the conference, or the symposium, the workshop overall has 2 aims. The first is to highlight the significance of the Caribbean for humanistic and social science scholarship on colonialism, slavery, capitalism, and modernity. The second is to highlight the rich and extensive holdings of the Research Institute for the Study of Man, which are now available in the NYU archives. In particular, the conference highlights 3 collections: the Trinidad Study, which includes hundreds of open-ended questionnaires by high school students in Trinidad on the eve of independence in 1962. The Puerto Rico Study, which includes field notes and interview transcriptions by young anthropologists, including Sid Mintz, from whom we heard last night and who will be here later today, all of whom were members of the People of Puerto Rico project in 1948. And the third collection is the Carl Withers Cuba collection, about which I'll say more momentarily. Actually, maybe yeah. Okay, each of the panels today is organized around one of the collections. They feature scholars, some of whom have worked extensively in the collections, and others whose work is related to the collections either methodologically or thematically. And our hope is to illustrate the kinds of work that these collections can help produce, and also to encourage young scholars interested in the Caribbean, in Caribbean themes, or in the history of American anthropology, say, to discover the collections for themselves. We begin with the panel on Cuba and the Withers collection. Carl Withers, as probably most of you will never know, don't know yet, Carl Withers was a not well-known American anthropologist who was trained at Columbia University. He spent time in central Cuba in the town of Mayahiwa in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. The collection here is a treasure trove of documents from that project. It includes, among many other things, it includes the field notes of Withers himself, his field notebooks. It includes the extensive, and in one case, massive writings of his Cuban informants, most of them young rural men, and also thousands of photographs from the Cuban fieldwork in the late 40s. The collection provides valuable insight into any number of issues: rural Cuban society in the 20th century, the encounter between the US and Cuba, between American anthropology and native ethnography, about authorship and voice. And I think we'll hear about some of these today from our panelists. Okay, so we have 3 speakers today. I'm just going to introduce all of them now so we don't have to interrupt the flow as we go on. Our first speaker is Professor Jorge Giovannetti, who is Associate Professor and Acting Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. He is the author of Sonidos de Condena, Sociabilidad, Historia y Política en la Música Reggae de Jamaica, which was published in Mexico in 2001. And he's the co-editor of a special issue on Garveyism in the Hispanic Caribbean in the journal Caribbean Studies in 2003. He is currently working on a book on Black British Caribbean migration in early 20th century Cuba, and he's also at work on a translation and selection of some of the materials from the Withers collection. Our second panelist is Olivia Gomes da Cunha, who teaches anthropology at the National Museum at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Her first book on vagrancy and identification science in Rio in the early 20th century was awarded and published by the National Archives there in 2002. She's been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, visiting professor at NYU, and a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation fellow in 2002. She has published on post-emancipation and social movements in Brazil and Cuba, and her manuscript on ethnography, archives, and artifacts of knowledge is under review for publication. Her current research, initiated in 2009, is about art, creativity, movie production, and other post-Civil War cultural transformations among the Maroons of Eastern Suriname. and she's also at work on a project related to withers. Our final speaker is Ana Vera, who is investigadora titular. I meant to translate these titles, and I forgot, so if you'll bear with me. Investigadora titular and vicedirectora of research at the Instituto Juan Marinello in Havana, Cuba. She's also the academic coordinator for the permanent Spanish-Cuban seminar on family, cultural identity, and social change, and she's been doing that since 2000. She's the author of numerous articles, and she's just finished a book entitled Guajiros del Siglo XXI, which will appear very shortly from the editorial Juan Marinello. She is also a noted practitioner of contemporary oral history and testimony, having worked on life histories and family histories in rural sugar, or actually now former sugar zones in contemporary Cuba. Okay, and so our first speaker is Jorge.
You hear me? Yeah. I'm going to get a little bit out of script to say thank you to Ada for putting this together and for all the people working with her. The second thing out of script is that I have a lot of people to acknowledge, but there are too much, so there's a slide in the PowerPoint presentation that mentions them all, so I'm not going to mention this. The other thing is that I want to start somehow by the conclusions in case I don't have enough time, so that probably you know more or less where I'm going. The first already Ada pointed out how relevant these collections are, and they have a lot of information that we can use for different sorts of projects on race, ethnicity, class, rural society, religion. So they are very rich in terms of what we can do with them, and I want particularly graduate students to know about it. That being said, and this is very important, there is really a methodological challenge in terms of how we use these sources. These were sources that were produced by anthropologists. So there is a methodological challenge in terms of how we deal with them and how we deal with them responsibly. And also to announce that these translations hopefully are going to be available for people that don't speak Spanish or that want to have this in English. I hope to finish them soon. And we are in coordination with the University Archives. Okay, with that, I guess I'll start with the formal script. In 2007 was when I encountered the Manolo manuscript, which was part of a materials Carl Withers produced when he did fieldwork in the 1940s in Cuba. He donated this to the Research Institute for the Study of Man in 1917 before he died. When I entered the building of RISM, the Withering manuscript, if you allow me to play with words, was inside a glass box as part of an exhibit that year. The 1,500 sensitive beige-colored pages were typewritten in a single space by Juan Manuel Picabea. They also had scribbles and annotations by Withers. Page after page, this manuscript contained hundreds of stories and endless information about the society and culture of Mayagüa, the central Cuban town where Withers did his fieldwork from 1947 to 1949. It was there that he hired Picabea, who produced daily written reports that pile up to become what we know now as the manuscript. Ironically, Withers never produced a manuscript himself. He passed away in 1970 and left this rare item of Caribbean anthropological history with us, along with his field notes and hundreds of black and white photographs. There are two reasons why these materials were appealing to me. First, as someone who studied social sciences at the University of Puerto Rico, I was one of many reading Sidney Menzies' Tasso Trabajador de la Caña, the much delayed Spanish edition of Worker in the Cane. Many of the stories written by Picabea, as well as some of the facts recorded by Withers' field notes, were reminiscent of Smith's popular book. Through the life of one individual, Tasso Sayas, Working in the Cane provided a unique view of rural life in Puerto Rico during the post-war years, which is the same that Picabea's writing did for Cuba. A comparison was somehow obvious, and more so if one considers the collaboration between these two unusual informants and the foreign ethnographers. The second consideration triggering my intellectual curiosity was precisely related to the ethnographers. Means had earned his PhD at Columbia University and was part of a team assembled by Julian Stewart to do fieldwork in Puerto Rico in the late 1940s. It turns out that Withers had also been enrolled at Columbia's anthropology department, although slightly earlier. He possibly coincided with Maurice Siegel, the first anthropologist to do fieldwork in a rural community in Puerto Rico. But Withers and Mintz never coincided enough to possibly share commonality of their respective fieldwork, which in hindsight seems rare given a number of near-miss crossroads. Withers was teaching English at Brooklyn College when Mintz started his major at that institution precisely in English, even though he switched to psychology. They were both at Columbia, and while Withers was out of the anthropology program when Mintz arrived, they were both in touch with Ruth Benedict during the 1940s. Later on, when Mintz interviewed for his Yale appointment with faculty including Ralph Linton, Withers had just finished his year there working with Linton, his former mentor at Columbia. Also, Mintz and Withers were both in contact with Vera Rubin, so in a sense the absence of a serendipitous encounter is probably only understood by the generational gap between the two individuals and probably the different life and academic path that they followed. From where I was coming from, and given what I have just outlined, my quick getaway answer was, when I was asked about my research with the Carl Withers manuscript collection, was that I was working with a Cuban tasso. So that was the easy way to get out of that question. But the question is whether that analogy was accurate. In a way, the answer is yes. Both ethnographers were trained at Columbia, if indeed probably separated by a transition in the Department of Anthropology. Both informants live in areas dominated by sugar and were generous sharing the knowledge with an outsider, albeit in different ways. But there are contrasts. A latecomer to anthropology, Withers was Tasso's age, 40, when he went to do fieldwork. Manolo, on the other hand, was in his 20s when he met Withers, which is more or less the age that Mintz had when he met Tasso. But both Manolo and Tasso were hard workers, yet at very different jobs and under very, very different circumstances, with Tasso being a sugar proletariat, needing to feed a family, and Manolo still living with his father while working in clerical jobs as a telegrapher in the postal service and as a journalist for El Mundo. But even with the contrast, or perhaps because of them, putting Withers' research enterprise face-to-face with that of Mintz and other social scientific work in the post-war Puerto Rico seemed to be a provocative project. But as much as intellectual histories of anthropologists could be appealing, my interest here is more with the informants and what their experience can tell us about rural life of ordinary people in two Caribbean societies before or as they underwent important social, political, and economic transformations. Puerto Rico, led by the Popular Democratic Party, would be the testing ground for a development strategy that will cause dramatic changes in the island's population and economy. Cuba, under Fulgencio Batista's power and influence, was becoming a fermenting ground for a socio-political revolution that changed Cuba forever. In Puerto Rico, Tasso, quote, played a role in the development of party-based political activity in the Puerto Rican countryside and in the eventual coming to power of the Popular Party there, unquote. In Cuba, Juan Manuel Picabea would leave Mayagüez to become a radio broadcaster and play a role in the fight against Batista's dictatorship through concealed messages on air. In an interview we made in 2008, he told us that he had to go into hiding once when the dictatorship targeted his station. He told us that Batista's military, quote, raided the station, but they did not catch me there, which was their intention, unquote. He added, quote, if I get caught, I would not have a great time, unquote. Clearly, we are in front of two individuals that were standing at the center of two of the most important transformations of 20th century Caribbean history. In the short time available to me here, I aim to identify some similarities and differences of the being there of these two experiences in Cuba and Puerto Rico, while not neglecting the being there of the anthropologists, which is ultimately why we have this information available to us. I hope here to rely more on the being there of the informants. In Picabea's case, his written testimony has been archived at RISM and now at NYU under the ethnographer's name as the Carl Withers manuscript collection. I therefore aim to unwither Manolo, as it were, by relying on his direct accounts and to use him as a pivot to move to potential Puerto Rican comparisons. While his physical appearance at 82 was withering when we met him in 2008, his spirit was unwavering, and as he shared experiences and knowledge, which also gave more vitality to his written statement. Now, in terms of politics, which is one of the comparisons I'm going to mention, one of the parallels between the Cuban and Puerto Rican fieldwork sites is the presence of sugar plantations dominating the towns of Mayagüa and Jauca. I do not need to stress here the impact that the sugar industry had in the overall human experience in and around the sites that where they were established. They had implications for the labor and class arrangements, as well as the experiences with social inequality and political agency. In Cuba in particular, sugar industry workers became an important political constituency, especially after the revolution in 1933. Mayagüa was not the exception, and it was, in fact, the very fertile place politically for some of the leftist forces active during and after the 1933. In his interview, Picabea told us, quote, "The predominant party there was the Socialist Party. That the mayor was a socialist. It was Joselito Ruiz. They related well with the people. I remember well Felix Torres, who was one of the agents there," unquote. In the manuscript, Picabea wrote about Torres' political activities, although at the time he was identified not as a socialist, but as, quote, the communist leader in Mayagüa. And there's constant reference of socialist being a sort of a code word for communist in Mayagüa. Picabea characterized Torres' rhetoric as offensive against the Partido Revolucionario Cubano Auténtico, adding that he was, quote, a diminutive speaker but of an immensely large tongue, unquote. In another manuscript entry about politics, Picabea wrote that an anti-communist named Julio Ibarra told him that the Partido Socialista Popular made false promises to its constituents when they sold useless bonds at 50 cents and $1. A similar charge of failed political promises appears in Puerto Rico, according to Tasso's narration in Worker in the Cane. Quote, "The Socialist Party leaders had made me a promise that I would have worked, that if they shared in winning the elections, they would help me in one way or another. But after the elections were over, I went to them different times with the end that they afforded me what they had offered me, and they never gave me a chance," unquote. Tasso's grievances were evident as he complains of other people being paid in the voting place, while he only received food during the celebration in the municipal hall. Quote, "They never gave me a penny, and I know they had money because they got help from different places and they collected money with our help, but never did they give me anything or met the promise they made me, that they would give me some little job. That too, they failed to give me," unquote. In terms of gender and politics in rural environments, Picabea's manuscript entry of November 13, 1949 indicates that the only one listening to the, quote, nonsensical speeches by representatives of the different parties were the men standing in their porches. He says, the, quote, "women were walking up and down the streets along with their female friends, their friends and husbands or boyfriends," unquote. Such narrative would give the impression of lack of activism by women, but in an earlier report, Picabea wrote about another political rally in which there was a speech by a female candidate for representative of the Socialist Popular Party. Her name was Violeta Ibáñez, and she was from Mayagüa. Picabea described her as a pretty woman, beautiful and tiposa, which I don't know how to translate, but complained that despite her beautiful voice, she was apparently not accustomed to talk through a microphone because she seemed clumsy. From what we learn from Tasso and Mintz, there is not equivalent woman political leader in Barrio Jauca, which does not mean that women were lacking political agency there. Tasso tells that, quote, "Elizabeth was one of those socialists who used to like to get dressed in a red dress with red stockings, and she would go there to vote, a veritable torch," unquote. He adds that Ellie always voted for the same party as I did, which might indicate either the political affinities as a couple or how the political choices of the woman were limited in those days. But whatever limits women political involvement existed at the time, those were precisely the ones that made sartorial preferences a political statement, you know, in terms of the red dress. So comparatively, this leads me to think of the women walking up and down in the streets of Mayagüa and raise questions. How were they dressed? What they were talking while they were walking in Mayagüa. So in a sense, sort of seeing Tasso sort of making me go back to Mayagüa and raise questions. Now, in the field of religion, which is another area for comparison between Cuba and Puerto Rico, one of the things that is interesting is that incidentally both Picabea and Tasso were non-practicing Catholics that ended up converted to Pentecostalism. Healing, or the hope of it, was central to both conversions, for Tasso his hernia, and for Manolo his loss of eyesight. These individual experiences, however personal, point toward the changes in religious culture in both islands. The information provided in the Manolo manuscript for Cuba that included in ethnographies from early 20th century pictured the relative weakening of Catholicism after 1898 in two former Spanish colonies. Simultaneously, both islands experienced the emergence, strengthening, and heightening visibility of new religious practices. Carl Wither's initial field notes when he arrived to Cuba suggested the lack of church presence. And in the 2008 interview that we made to Picabea, he stressed that the Catholic Church was the only one in Mayagüa. Indeed, some of the first entries in the manuscript refer to the Holy Week, with Picabea lamenting how the enthusiasm for Catholic traditions was, quote, diminishing. Quote, remember the very strict way in which during previous years the sacred rules of the Holy Week were undertaken, and comparing it with the way in which is now done, it's easy to realize that as years go by, the belief in God diminishes increasingly more, and with it the respect and maybe the good faith, unquote. As an example, he mentioned the story of a black family that, quote, mocking the sacred laws of the church and maybe not giving validity to them, unquote, opted to kill and eat pork during Holy Friday. In another entry of the manuscript entitled The Methodists in Mayagüa, Picabea wrote about a North American visitor seeking to, quote, foment the atmosphere of that religion in the town. He asserted, since I came to Mayagüa, I have heard of no religion operating at great scale other than the Catholic, which has most booming in Mayagüa, and especially in Nela Sugar Mill, which is the true center in the zone is to be found. The center of the Catholic Church was in Mayagüa. Okay, thanks for that. And one of the interesting things, one of the interesting contrasts here is that apparently Mayagüa remained very Catholic, and he compares it with other places that had influence from other churches. But another interesting contrast is that, and this, you know, when one contrasts with other works like Maurice Siegel's A Puerto Rican Town and the other work by Anthony LaRufa, is that you find that in both cases, at least in Siegel's and in Min's reflection in the conclusion of Tasso, there's a reference to these revivalist churches and Protestant churches being important for poor people in the rural areas. And there's one quote from the Manolo manuscript where he actually emphasizes that the Catholic Church was important, but for the well-off people in the Mayagüa community, especially in the Nela Sugar Mill. So you will find this contrast that, you know, it's worth exploring. I'm not making any conclusions here, but I'm just sort of throwing some things to the air. Sort of in Siegel's case, you find the same, you know, sort of what he calls superficial Catholicism in the case of Puerto Rico. And I guess, you know, while I'm a beginner in Puerto Rican history in general, some of you know I started with Jamaica, Cuba, and the British West Indies, and now I'm getting to Puerto Rico. And I'm actually recent arrival to post-1933 Cuban history. I suspect that the archives of these post-war Caribbean ethnographies may have much to teach us about religious history, and several questions seem relevant. What impact did changes in religious belief had in the values and worldviews of rural ordinary people? What role, in turn, did these values and worldviews played when facing dramatic social and political and economic transformations as the ones I pointed out? Or what effect did the religious landscape had in the rhetoric of the political actors implementing these transformations? Some of you that know the history of Luis Muñoz Marin's and some of the rhetoric he used was actually very similar to sort of a religious style of speaking. So I wish I had more time to share other potential fruitful comparisons on issues such as the non-established religious practices, Spiritism, Afro-Caribbean religions, and issues of race and ethnicity. That's why I started with the conclusions. Emmeline Brown and I had already advanced some of the potential avenues for research of the Carl Wither's manuscript collection in a research note we published in the journal Caribbean Studies in 2009, and you can see that, or ask me for it. And hopefully a collective research project with Cuban and Puerto Rican colleagues will produce some publication in the future. But I am sure that the recent collections now held at NYU archives will provide plenty of material for researchers and graduate students to make a good and responsible use of them in articles, dissertations, and research papers. Thank you very much. I think
So I would like to thank Ada for inviting me to come and share with all of you my first thought on Witter's material. I ask you to forget for a while everything now we know about Picabea and about Manolo. And what I would like to invite you to do is just to considering the challenging of looking at archival material from an ethnographical point of view, from an anthropological point of view. In one of her creative interventions into the way in which anthropologists make use of the notion of context, Marilyn Strathern provocatively locates the latter, quoting, "in our heads, not out there," closing. In this paper, I take this observation as a starting point to explore some of the consequences of the fact that can create multiple contexts in our heads, applying this idea to research into certain kinds of artifacts, those we designate documents and textual artifacts. What happens when a young resident from a small village in rural Cuba is hired to write about the world, a term used by Carl Witters, in which he, his relative, and his neighbors live? My hypothesis, when I look to explore here, is that the young Manolo took seriously his capacity to create something other than simply testimony. Manolo, Witter's principal informant, created himself, his neighbors, these strange beings in the world in which they cohabited, as a certain type of artifact, a data. In the work of making Mayahigua village and its people, he not only focused on the things observed, dreamed, and known by others, but also on the creation of multiple planes and perspective that made the knowledge of the former possible. Because consequently, the work of creation involved, different relations between human and non-human beings. The data produced by Manolo can thus be apprehended as an almost infinite succession of planes or context through which the world in which he lived could become known. To understand how these modes of creation traversed the knowledge produced by Manolo, I begin with a passage in which he described his encounter with a material and tactile artifact that seems to have had a substantial effect in the days following his first encounter with Witter, quoting, "Some days before proposing to buy this typewriter from Joselito Calvo, I was typing with it and thought to myself there was no way I could purchase it. Afterwards, though, I realized that I could work with it perfectly. I tried to locate everything, and indeed I found them. The keyboard gets stuck in capitals. It's slow going because it always falls into capitals whenever you type more quickly. Now I'm going to leave the paper here to go and see some guys who are playing to report to you on what's happening," closing. As Manolo mentioned, reporting what he saw was not just a question of him working to earn a living. The papers marked with mechanically printed type were treated as sensible objects through which certain things could be said. Consequently, we need to understand not only what Manolo had to say about Mayahigua and their residents, but also how he wanted to transform this knowledge into text. This inversion in relevance is necessary since it singularizes a way of speaking about the things that Manolo saw, knew, and believed, and about those things which he claimed to have known despite never have seen them. Thus, over the course of this presentation, the textual objects created by Manolo will be referred to as artifacts. This concept, as formulated by Marilyn Strathern, allows us to explore the events, experience, and people implied in the production of the materiality stored and protected by Witter's collection. As raw material, kept from notebooks and field notes written by Witters, the writing of Manolo survive among the papers forming the Anthropologist's collection. They remain there as a kind of autobiographical source for an ethnography that was never finished. Were them too sparse, unreliable, or insufficient then? I don't think so. However, for reason other than the observation that Witters considered everything that Manolo and his neighbors said to be valid. I think that the answer depends on another question: insufficient for what? The reporting mentioned by Manolo seems to have included something more than details on the houses, occupations, and localizations of residents, a map composed of small numbered fragments through which the families of each of the residents could be identified, based on Witter's own initial sketch. Manolo's descriptions seem to be interrupted by fragments of affects and effects of memory, by signaling different depths to the space-time of the towns and colonies in which he lived. At the same time, he did not intend to transform them into what Witters called an autobiography. So can we read Manolo's observation, leaving out the interest and the absent presence of Witters? When Manolo went to work for Witters, it was the first time he used a typewriter. The purchase of the equipment and the ingenious way he found of using the keyboard seem to have been crucial events in his life and discovery of a new universe. The trabajo took up a sizable part of his day, and the quest for more and more information was a constant preoccupation. Quoting, "A few nights ago, I wanted to write a number of things for my work, but I didn't have enough material to go on. So it set me thinking how to get it, and the idea came to head off into town to hear, see, and try to delve into a matter, something I've done often, in fact." Closing. In various passages, he describes his experiences of interviewing people, using chance conversations as source of inspiration or data for his writing. In a text entitled "Me Interviewing Some Guys," he tells that he had gone out, quoting, "to walk around town for a while to see if I could find someone to interview or a group playing to discover what they are talking about and tell you. A few minutes after setting out, I bumped into a guy whose name I don't recall, but who everyone knows by the nickname Oriental. As soon as I saw this guy arrive, I said to myself, that is my subject matter." Closing. Manolo's conversation or interview with the passing acquaintance Oriental can be taken not as evidence of the veracity of the narrated situations, incontestable proof that would transform Witter's ethnography into a shrewd description of the relations between simple folk in their own terms and language, but as indication that Manolo did not consider himself to be equal to those he was observing. Even more importantly, the resident of Mayahigua had realized that observation by its very nature involves an encounter with incomprehension and misunderstanding. Quoting Manolo again, I immediately spoke to the guy and tried to drum up a conversation with him, but it was impossible for me because he lacks any basic understanding and tried to laugh at me every time I spoke in earnest. Closing. And in numerous passages of Manolo text, Withers appears a kind of supervisor. However, it would be a mistake to imagine the former as a disciplined student, an hesitant apprentice, or a skilled imposter. Manolo seems to unite all the qualities needed to be a fine ethnographer. He took the work for which he was paid seriously and conducted interviews, participated in events, traveled to nearby localities, verified and cross-checked information given to him and gave due credit to his informants. In addition, Manolo counted on local help. In some passage, he tells how people came to him to tell their stories since they understood his work. The later writings made by Manolo, the separation between everything he saw, the separation between society and the things that he experienced and heard, places he visited and those he knew existed, beings he had met and those he feared, things that frightened him and those he desired, becomes more tenuous and sometimes non-existent. Sometimes the desires and huntings were experienced by his characters and informants, and other times the strange things wandering Esmeralda and Mayahigua were the same as those inhabiting his dreams and memory. Manolo suspected that some of the things he wanted to write about would be, quoting, of little importance or of no interest. The point of the social universe described by Manolo defined boundaries distinct to those mapped by Withers, and here perhaps it's worth exploring a little deeper, we won't have time to that, this amplified way of conceiving society. Manolo observed other places located beyond the borders of Mayahigua and the anthropologist's interest. His narrative juxtaposes a series of conjunctions that establish a contingent link between things that can be seen and others that can be spoken about. Hence, the properties of the senses and those of the visible world seem to be continually in relation insofar as the things described and those sensed are always depicted as Bruno Latour said, partially existent. The things that, the things that Manolo saw, heard about, and knew to exist also underwent a kind of metamorphosis, though not in the same direction or obeying the same purposes as those imagined perhaps by Withers. There were another kind and did not presume, not presume the transition from one structure, system, or social order to another. Transformation for Manolo seemed to imply the way in which visible and invisible things affect each other. The society he described was then a singular configuration of enchantment or association existing between mutually implicated things. As an observer, his work involved highlighting situation, events, and evidence in which different modes of implication seem to be more salient. I'm heading to the conclusion. A description of Maya Higua seen from Manolo's perspective must include, therefore, another class of beings beyond the residents, Cubans, workers, island immigrants, spirits, ghosts, embodied in people and animal, since an animal or simply adopting curious form temporarily. In part extension of human agency or presence, but also present, albeit partially, in other transformation, not exclusively generated by human action. Ghosts wandered in colonies, villages, yard, batallas, and sugarcane producing harm, bringing ruin to families living the streets deserted and torturing the slumber of the dead. Their somewhat diffuse presence enabled confusion, but it seemed easy to describe their forms, differentiating those who were personas from those who were muertos. Between belief and respect about these creatures, Manolo preferred to identify what he really believed to exist. Ghosts exist because their actions have concrete consequence. Women and men are dishonored, excuse me. The dead were not properly remembered. Outside thieves can be unmasked. Ghosts can be seen wrapped in sheets with wooden legs and sparkling lights. With sorcery, the opposite seems to occur. It's impossible to know who practices evil magic and who is affected. Winter's field notes, in which he relates his encounters with various other residents of Maya Higua, are full of observation concerning the credulity, ignorance, and ingenuity of people like Manolo and his neighbors. Withers gave particular emphasis to some examples of false beliefs. As well as ghosts, he also listened to the belief that black people were inferior, that Haitians hate children, and that flying saucer exist. Although the evidence of superstitions and false consciousness associated with entities recognizable in Withers' cartography were readily incorporated into his analysis of social structures, the ghost, chupacabras, and flying saucer resisted any such framing. These were not genuinely religious expression nor natural elements that had never been captured in the local police records, and it was not always possible to talk about them. These beings were not identified by believers only. Manolo, for example, had a respectful relation to them, explaining why ghosts and the spirits share the same space as the other characters of Maya Higua. If we take Manolo's ethnography seriously without forgetting that it remains the outcome of his encounter and relations with Withers, we need to clear up a recurrent misunderstanding. Manolo cannot be considered an ethnographer on the basis that he wrote about his peer in a singular way. It would be naive to believe that when he did his work, he considered himself equal to those he interviewed and observed. It is precisely this difference, the possibility of becoming a non-equal by writing about Maya Higua, which makes Manolo an ethnographer. The presence of non-human creatures in the Maya-Higua social universe cannot be taken as an idiosyncrasy of Manolo alone. Their existence cannot be isolated under vague rubrics like fabulation, imagination, and representation. Non-human creatures cited in the form of gods, ghosts, animal, and human spirits, and unknown animated objects suffuse the text of other Reuters reporters. Although in some passages, Manolo and the others also include reference to these creatures as examples of the tales and legends that Reuters was so keen to collect, they do not seem to have believed that their existence was limited to the human imagination. Hence, any attempt to isolate them on a level of existence distinct from that which encompasses the relations between the local resident and the new arrivals, easily giving the adjective social, would imply a kind of reduction. Thank you very much.
Yo quiero hablarles de un libro que acabo de terminar. No tiene mucho que ver con las dos presentaciones que me precedieron, pero en cierto modo sí tiene que ver. Tiene que ver con el punto de vista desde la propia cultura. Voy a concentrarme en algunos aspectos de este trabajo que tienen que ver con problemas metodológicos que enfrenté al proponerme esta temática. El trabajo se trata de un libro que refiere resultados de una investigación de campo en un central de matanzas, una investigación que realicé entre el año 2004 y 2006, en una coyuntura de mucha tensión socioeconómica y quizás política también. Okay. En ese... No.
Yeah, her talk is not directly related to what preceded it. She did field work in a rural region in Matanzas, in what had been a central during the period when in 2002, when the Cuban government closed about 75 sugar mills. So she's going to focus more on methodological aspects of doing that kind of field work in that moment of transformation.
Sí. En el momento en que se dio a conocer la resolución 77 del 2002, que declaraba el cierre de la mitad de los centrales existentes en el país, muchos tomamos conciencia de que una realidad presumiblemente asentada en un presente eterno en cuanto al peso dominante de la producción azucarera en la economía nacional estaba dejando de existir. Esa coyuntura potenció un debate sobre el futuro de la economía cubana e incluso también del proyecto socialista. Los objetivos de mi trabajo fueron conocer el impacto de los cambios en el campesinado productor de caña, recoger su experiencia y contribuir a socializarla mediante un texto dirigido a un lector no especializado. El objeto de estudio fue la historia de una familia campesina de origen canario en la zona de producción tradicional matancera, en tanto la historia de la familia permite una visión personalizada de los grandes acontecimientos sociales. El marco disciplinar fue la historia de la industria azucarera por una parte, la sociología rural por otra, y la historia oral que me permitió recoger la huella de procesos socioeconómicos recientes. Los problemas que tuve que enfrentar son básicamente los siguientes. Primero, obtener las autorizaciones pertinentes para abordar un tema que no es frecuente en las investigaciones culturales cubanas. Luego, localizar y seleccionar las fuentes bibliográficas, documentales, abundantes, dispersas y mal representadas en las bibliotecas públicas. Luego, encontrar un central recién clausurado para desarrollar el trabajo de campo, lograr una relación de confianza con los sujetos, definir los límites de permisividad para el uso de los testimonios, por la fuerza que llega a alcanzar el control social, proponer una interpretación justa del significado de los cambios y encontrar un estilo adecuado para comunicar los resultados. Los campesinos recibieron los beneficios de las leyes de reforma agraria en los años 60 y los procesos socioeconómicos derivados de las políticas sociales posteriores invirtieron el sentido de los cambios al devolver al Estado muchas de las tierras inicialmente distribuidas y contribuyeron a distanciar al campesino de la tierra. La traducción del mundo rural para un lector no especialista implica el reto de componer una imagen no estereotipada de la vida del campesino y los procesos en que se ha visto inmerso. Una imagen que rebase también el distanciamiento de la perspectiva sociológica al uso, causante de la escasa difusión que alcanza entre el gran público la literatura científica sobre temas azucareros y la invisibilidad de las implicaciones culturales de la transformación socioeconómica contemporánea.
Cubans speak very fast, and I can't quite follow in the written text. So, just to go back a little bit, she described the project as she found a peasant family of Spanish origin, Canary Island, in a zone that traditionally a high-producing sugar zone. She did the field work between 2004 and 2006, so this central she found a central that had recently closed, and she followed one family to understand their experience of that profound transformation. In some sense, well, I'll stop there. She said something about agrarian reform, but yeah.
Sí, estaba diciendo que los campesinos realmente disfrutaron los beneficios de la reforma agraria, pero que los programas sociales asociados a las reformas agrarias fueron la causa de que algunas de las tierras entregadas regresaran al Estado.
So in the early period, peasants, campesinos benefited from the agrarian reform, but some of the social programs of the revolution meant that peasants were increasingly distanced from land, right? And that some of that, in terms of moving to the city and other opportunities, and that, in effect, caused that some of those same lands returned to the state as peasants were separated from land.
Para procesar historias de sujetos individuales y llegar a una historia de familia, trabajé con la propuesta de Bertolt del Croix sobre la ventana de observación. Ellos llaman de esa manera. Este sirvió de criterio para seleccionar los sujetos a entrevistar. De acuerdo con este criterio, el hecho de que representantes de una generación hayan desaparecido o no se encuentren disponibles no implica imposibilidad de obtener la perspectiva generacional que ellos representan, ya que otras personas vinculadas con la familia y pertenecientes a la misma posición genealógica pueden tomar su lugar. Para obtener la profundidad histórica que era necesario, pues trabajé con 3 generaciones de sujetos de una misma familia. Las entrevistas fueron realizadas en las viviendas. Las comencé como un diálogo con una pregunta básica: hábleme de su vida. El material resultante lo analicé 2 veces, primero para restablecer la cronología de los hechos y luego para elaborar una interpretación de las palabras sobre la base de someterlas a interrogantes con ayuda de otros testimonios, con lecturas y consultas a expertos. Y este procedimiento implica una reelaboración de los testimonios respetando los giros del lenguaje propios de los sujetos. El recurso se conoce como entrevista biográfica narrativa, en la que se pide a la persona que cuente su vida y en la que la narración inicial es la historia contada, diferente a la historia vivida. Con esta primera pregunta obtuve una gran cantidad de material que complementé con otras preguntas para precisar ciertos detalles sobre los estudios, la vida en la colonia, las tareas domésticas, los trabajos del campo y el central, la elección de pareja, el noviazgo, la crianza de los hijos, las formas de recreación, la relación con la tierra, el impacto de las leyes de reforma agraria. Y quise conocer también opiniones sobre el cierre del central, los resultados de las medidas aplicadas para reorganizar la vida en la comunidad después del cierre del central y los proyectos de vida individuales asociados a los nuevos proyectos estatales.
Okay, she selected one family in this town, and she interviewed 3 generations of the same family. She began the interviews with a very general question: tell me about your life. And from there she went on to more specific things to ask about things like child rearing, food, family life, daily life work, much of the same kinds of things that appear, for example, in Manolo's manuscript. And she asked also about their experience of things, of the initial agrarian reform, their more recent experience of the closing of the mill. And also she posed a question at the beginning of the section of the challenge of working, in a sense, with a disappearing subject, that it's right, as a disappearing campesinado.
La observación fue una técnica secundaria y la desarrollé básicamente en el espacio social comunitario, no dentro de las viviendas. El objetivo principal fue contextualizar las entrevistas. Hice observaciones en lugares de la comunidad, calles, caminos, viviendas, fuera de las viviendas. Paseos, en reuniones informales, en la cooperativa, en el museo, en la capilla, una capilla improvisada, en la escuela del Ministerio del Azúcar, etc. Solicité también acceso a documentos familiares y fotos y me entregaron una variedad amplia de documentos y recortes de prensa y notas manuscritas e incluso el manuscrito de una novela escrita por una mujer de la familia. Utilicé el recurso de la fotografía como algo complementario, como si fuese un ojo discreto para registrar aquello que cualquier transeúnte hubiese podido observar desde la carretera, para no alterar el clima de confianza logrado con los sujetos. El último aspecto de método que quiero mencionar es el problema ético que plantea el uso de la información obtenida y la cuestión del estilo. La relación asimétrica que los sujetos aceptan en una situación de entrevista del tipo biográfico presupone confianza en la pericia y discreción del investigador, pero esta confianza no es permanente y se altera si el investigador incurre en falta de tacto o revela secretos y opiniones celosamente guardados. Al constatar la emoción contenida en los juicios críticos sobre la forma en que se había desarrollado el proceso de redimensionamiento en el central, decidí enmascarar la identidad de mis sujetos con el uso de seudónimos, aunque revelando el lugar específico donde se realizó el estudio para acompañar los testimonios con información histórica sustentada en trabajo de archivo. De esta manera, he mantenido fuera del debate a los sujetos reales y pude utilizar sus argumentos como criterios de expertos. Las emociones tienen una vida propia y ajena a la voluntad racional y la investigación cultural debe tomarlas en consideración.
She is wrapping up her methodological section, or talking about her method in the field. She said part of what she did is not spend. She didn't spend all the time with her subjects in their homes. She kind of spent time in other institutions in the town. She collected manuscripts, artifacts, including a manuscript written by a woman of the family, a manuscript of a novel. She raised also the ethical or asymmetrical nature, or the ethical question about the asymmetrical nature of the interview process, and for her the significance of emotions revealed, right, and that they're part of she makes them a central part of the study as well. Of course, she used pseudonyms for all the people involved so as not to identify them publicly.
Las fisuras de un discurso y unas políticas macrosociales en las que no estaban representados los puntos de vista de los actores que entrevisté fueron motivo de desvelo para mí. Por una parte, ponderaba razones y argumentos sobre deberes y derechos para estudiar un problema sociocultural que consideré de gran magnitud, y por otra, valoraba los límites, las fronteras que impone trabajar en la propia cultura. A diferencia de un antropólogo clásico, que es siempre un ajeno, un outsider, no sometido a severos controles por parte de la comunidad estudiada que le impidan expresar su pensamiento, el investigador que trabaja en su propia cultura es parte de un colectivo para quien los territorios abiertos a la investigación están compartimentados. En este caso, la escritura no debe traicionar ninguno de los pactos que acotan la vida del científico, la sociedad en que vive, la vida económica y la comunidad donde realiza su trabajo. Voy a hablar brevemente de los dos capítulos de testimonio que están incluidos en el libro. Están estructurados de acuerdo al eje del tiempo. El primero se refiere al mundo tradicional del colono cañero por una parte, y el segundo se refiere a la disolución de este mundo tradicional y a los caminos divergentes que toman varias colonias de caña de acuerdo a la composición de las familias que las ocupan y a los proyectos de vida de los protagonistas.
She's going to focus the rest of her time on two of the chapters from this book of testimonies. The first chapter is on the traditional world of the sugarcane colonia. And the second is the dissolution of that world after 2002.
Sí, lo que llama el mundo tradicional se ubica entre 1925 y 1963. Este capítulo está compuesto por cuatro fragmentos, son 4 testimonios. El primero es el relato fundacional de la colonia en 1925, desde una perspectiva masculina. El segundo fragmento es la misma historia contada por una mujer de la misma generación y focalizada en las diferencias de perspectiva masculina y femenina respecto básicamente a la educación de las mujeres y a la vida familiar. La tercera es una perspectiva generacional diferente desde el grupo más joven, y a esta parte le llamé la leyenda del Bajío, porque es la historia del pasado familiar que ellos cuentan, pero la cuentan con las características propias de la visión de otra generación. Este capítulo termina con una serie de cuentos que recogí de la tradición oral local, donde es decir, el elemento del cuento popular, del cuentero popular, formaba parte de la vida cultural en esa comunidad tradicional. No es que haya desaparecido en la actualidad, pero el peso que tiene es más pequeño. El otro capítulo, sobre la disolución del mundo tradicional, se refiere a la diáspora familiar a partir del casamiento de las 3 mujeres más jóvenes de la familia representada en el capítulo anterior, que se casan con colonos del mismo lugar y se van a otras colonias, y este capítulo pues se refiere justamente a un momento posterior de la vida campesina en 3 lugares de allí mismo. La primera, además son tres historias diferentes y tienen un destino diferente cada una de ellas. La primera historia es la de una colonia que fue entregada a la cooperativa, es decir, vendida en los años 80, por que la mujer enviuda y tiene hijos pequeños que no se pueden hacer cargo de la finca, y bueno, ella entrega esta finca y luego uno de los hijos intenta rescatar la tradición familiar y hace un convenio con el Estado para explotar una colonia de esas que el Estado está dando a contrato en este momento. Él cuenta en este capítulo, hace el enlace, por eso uso esta imagen, porque él hace el enlace entre el paisaje natural que él recordaba de niño y el paisaje que él está tratando de reconstruir en esa colonia nueva. La otra historia es la de una finca, le llamé el hombre de éxito, porque este es un campesino que compró la colonia en el año 50 y todavía hoy la está explotando, ya está viejo, pero tiene un heredero que trabaja con él, que no fue demasiado a la escuela y por lo tanto es el campesino del futuro. Esta estabilidad económica como productores de caña le han permitido acumular un capital ahora bastante importante, que les posibilita la conversión de la finca en una finca de producción diversa, ganadería y productos de consumo. Y al parecer, bueno, el destino posterior de esta colonia está garantizado, al parecer, siempre y cuando el dinero acumulado por estos jóvenes herederos no resulte en un factor disruptor de esta continuidad, por algo que voy a decir después. El último fragmento de este capítulo es el drama de una colonia que está llegando al final de su historia porque tiene herederos, es decir, la familia tiene herederos, pero los herederos se fueron a estudiar y los herederos no solo se prepararon como profesionales universitarios, sino que además los más jóvenes pues están buscando la vía para emigrar. Es el drama pues del final de una historia. Y el último pasaje es un diálogo posterior a la fecha en que se mueve la investigación con uno de los herederos que está preparándose para emigrar.
Okay, so in the chapter that she calls the traditional world, it includes several testimonies, all from very different perspectives. So some of them reflect on the founding of the colonia, which is a sugar farm linked to a mill in the late 1920s. And so one of the testimonies has to do with that. Another testimony comes from a woman of that same generation, so to get a different perspective on the same process. A third one comes, a third part of that comes of that chapter on those testimonies is has the focuses on people who have on diaspora. On kind of local diaspora, women of the family who've married and gone to work on other colonias, and so it follows them to these other places. Then the picture that she showed had to do with a family who owns a colonia, but continues to work the land, but plants it in things other than sugar. And then finally, the final set of testimonies she deals with in this section is a family in which the younger generations studied and no longer want to be farmers, and some are looking now to migrate and leave the country altogether. So it's that chapter focuses kind of on the end or the dissolution of a world.
Esta investigación me puso a reflexionar acerca de algo que a mi juicio ha pasado inadvertido para historiadores y sociólogos, porque pertenece a ese plano de las emociones, del mundo simbólico, invisibilizado por la tradición académica cubana, algo que yo llamaría algo así como el fenómeno de las migraciones cruzadas, entre hijos de campesinos sin preocupaciones monetarias que abandonan la tierra en busca de mejores condiciones de vida en las ciudades, y jóvenes profesionales de las ciudades a quienes sus salarios no les resultan suficientes y que dirigen sus pasos al campo para recampesinizarse, contando con que de esa manera pondrán fin a sus desvelos monetarios. Yo pido disculpas por el uso de un neologismo que no es mío y que pone de relieve la validez de una economía campesina como alternativa para desarrollar, a pesar de los riesgos que implica el poner en producción una colonia que está que no se está usando durante varios años desde que se abolió el cultivo de la caña.
Just a quick note here. She talks about something called crisscrossing migrations, in which the younger generations in a peasant family get educated and want to leave and go to the city to make a better world. And then once they're in the city and salaries are insufficient, they end up having to go back to the countryside or have links to the countryside in a way that represents a kind of repeasantization, but not quite.
Un sociólogo cubano escribía en el año 2005 que se rompió la tradición campesina con un alto costo de identidad y espiritualidad. Rectificar es de sabios. Podemos y debemos ajustar el modelo actual para darle continuidad a esta tradición. El modelo se ha reajustado varias veces. En la última versión hay un reciente libro de Juan Valdés Paz que se publicó en el 2009, pero que propone una periodización hasta el año 2007, donde se recupera la confianza en el azúcar y en la caña como un potencial importante para contribuir al desarrollo económico del país. Es una perspectiva optimista que recupera algo que en el 2002 parecía perdido para siempre, que fue objeto de debate en aquel momento. La perspectiva nueva que se apoya en un interés, en una confianza en que el trabajo sobre colonias entregadas en usufructo puede ser la solución para los problemas de la agricultura. Pues esta es la que se está aplicando ahora mismo. Sin embargo, ya voy a terminar. La historia de la antropología como ciencia es profusa en ejemplos de cómo del cambio tecnológico derivan imprevisibles cambios culturales que inciden directamente en la vida de los sujetos sociales. La investigación cultural cubana tiene en este sentido un campo de investigación propio.
Okay, two things. She said that the mills closed, or the 75 mills closed in 2002. She says that their recent work has been done, published in 2009 by Juan Valdez Paz, which on land and sugar and agricultural production through 2007, and that one of the things that it discusses is a kind of optimism about sugar, and that there even this is under debate, but there are moves to or thoughts of redistributing land to be worked
en
as
usufructo
sugar.
y no en posesión,
Yeah,
sino en
not
usufructo.
title, but use of land to cultivate sugarcane small scale. And then finally, she said that if you think about the history of anthropology, and here we can link it to work by Sidney Mintz and Jorge's paper on Manolo and Tasso, that it is clear that technological change produces social change, and that the complicated history of work and life in rapidly transforming sugar zones means that Cuba has a whole field for anthropological work that hasn't yet been done.
Sí, quiero mencionar un último detalle, es ese documento que tengo en la pantalla. Este es uno entre los documentos familiares que pude consultar. Este es el título de propiedad de la finca que se vendió a la cooperativa en el año 83. Es un título de propiedad escrito en una hoja de libreta, arrancada de una libreta, con una firma, con un texto casi legible y una firma también casi legible, que forma parte de la relación emocional que tiene esta familia en particular con la finca que perdió y la que tratan ahora de recuperar desde otro nuevo lugar, ¿no? Desde un lugar diferente de la sociedad. Es interesante porque lo que quiero que observen es la poca formalidad del documento, que es reflejo justamente de la premura con que muchas de las cosas se hicieron y que ahora mismo pues hay que enfrentar y que se están enfrentando de otra manera, ¿no? Los dueños, la viuda, sí, la vende a la cooperativa.
Okay, so this is the title of a sale from the owners of this farm to a cooperative, and she remarks on things like the informality of the document, just 2 pages ripped from a notebook. But she says that there's evidence of the family trying to kind of come back to that land under new forms.
Okay, gracias.
Thank you. Okay, we have some time for questions, so I think I'll just ask the panelists to come back to the table. And please feel free to ask a question in whatever language you want. If translation is needed, it'll be provided. English, Spanish, Portuguese may be a little harder, but we can do that too, I think. And okay, Connie.
I just wonder whether it wouldn't be a good idea to compare this process you're observing in Cuba. I wonder whether it wouldn't be a good idea to try to compare this process you're observing in Cuba with the process in an island such as Barbados, which was so totally into sugar. However, organized in a different form and which has really pretty much left sugar, except in efforts to try to come back to it no longer as plantations, but much more as privately owned pieces of the plantations to use sugar not just for rum, but for other products, and to get people to, this is a sort of contrasting but interesting contrast of getting people to grow some of the products that they're importing, because the major industry replacing sugar, which was practically total on the island, it had virtually no peasantry or very small holders of pieces of land, has been tourism. And so a large, which absorbs a certain amount of the labor force. Nobody really wants to go back to sugar as it existed there before, but they are trying to get them to do planting of products similar to what you were doing. Again, this is something they'll do, but only with an eye to moving into other occupations. So it seems to me that there are interesting parallels and interesting contrasts given the larger situation of comparing Cuba with Barbados. A very strong difference in context and history.
En realidad, cuando visité la isla de Barbados, fue un impacto muy fuerte, porque encontré casi en miniatura algunas cosas que conocía muy bien de Cuba, pero en miniatura, en pequeño, ¿no? En pequeña dimensión. No tuve un contacto suficiente, ni un tiempo suficiente en Barbados para explorar la historia del país. Y en el sentido de poder hacer una comparación más sustanciada sobre este proceso de reconversión de la producción básica del país, que además es mucho más antigua que en Cuba, pues con el proceso cubano. Pero evidentemente sí que hay similaridad en cuanto a lo que sucede, ¿no?, con estos pequeños países donde de pronto desaparece un cultivo que es invasivo completamente y tiene que fraccionarse la tierra para dedicarla a otras cosas. Pero ese fraccionamiento de la tierra viene acompañado con la necesidad de inversiones, y ahí es donde la diferencia realmente es muy grande, ¿no?
Okay, other questions? Yeah, Judy?
Thank you. This is two quick questions for Jorge. You made mention of the long delay in the publication of Worker and the Cane, 28 years, and Sid is here now. He could offer his opinion. Why do you think that was, between the 1960 English publication and 1988? And what was the reception in Puerto Rico when it finally came out? And the second question has to do with the comparative conversion experiences. I'm very struck by, of course, Tasso's conversion, as was the researcher himself by his own testimony in the book. But, you know, it has its parallels in Oscar Lewis's work on Pedro Martinez, who became a Seventh-day Adventist. And the list is pretty long. I jotted down quite a number of such experiences. Now, is that because the kind of person who makes a good research subject is the kind of person who will be susceptible to being open to a religious conversion experience, or is that, in your view, for some other reason?
As for the delay in the translation of Sid's book, I think he has answered that directly or indirectly in many publications, and Tony Lauria can also speak to it. But it's not secret that there was the team of which Sid was part initially when he went was not well viewed by some sectors of Puerto Rican academia, mainly nationalist. and certainly that made an impact in terms of the reception and the late publication of the book. I mean, there are many layers to this, and we could speak more about it, but mainly that would be probably one of the main reasons. There are also technical reasons. Probably Sid can elaborate in terms of the availability of the spools and the tapes and the conversion of it and the translation. I think that the originals were probably lost. So in many ways, I think that the English version is actually more faithful in terms of the translation. There is something, and Sid can elaborate on that. So that was mostly, but still today, you'll find this resentment against foreign scholars, or particularly that particular group, which at times I mean, I don't know whether the fact that I come from a different generation, I don't have any hard feelings. So it was like, how wonderful this book is, without knowing all the other things. So that would probably the main reason. Probably they can talk later whether I'm right or wrong. In terms of the conversion experience, in terms of Manolo's Picabet's experience, is basically healing. He has the hope of not having this loss of. He's losing his vision, which was very important for him as someone that had to observe and see things in a moment. So whether it was his position as a subject position was not the case. Probably was the hope of healing. What is different, though, in the case if you compare with Tasso, I mean, both were converted to Pentecostalism, which I found amusing. And in Tasso's case, of course, he wants to get rid of his pain, of his hernia. Is it different in timing? I have not pinpointed exactly the time, but the time of Manolo's conversion is post-revolution. So it's after the 50s, but certainly, the hope of being healed more than any other thing.
Just a quick note, when was the conversion? I mean, after 59, but when? Was it special period, pre-special period, post?
No, back. Yeah, way back, probably, I would say 70s. I mean, I don't know the exact date. I have to go back to my notes, but certainly sort of before the special period.
Yeah, this one is not a question, but a comment on that whole last issue. One of the things involved in this is that all these guys, they were great informants or great writers or great interlocutors, but one of the things that kind of preceded, in two cases, preceded the field experience, the field work that prompted these artifacts, these archival pieces that you're talking about. In two cases, Pedro Martinez and in Tasso's case, they had already been involved in projects of local social transformation, which for them were very central and very important. Apparently, Manolo was, involved in this too, both before the field work and especially afterwards, which is a very different situation for both Pedro Martinez and for Tasso. They were not. Actually, I think, and Sid can correct me on this, but I think by the time that Sid got there, Tasso had kind of given up on politics, or was in the process of giving up on politics and social transformation of a certain kind. Not that he believed in its benefit, not that he didn't believe in its benefits and continued to believe in the party that he saw as bringing the benefits. But he was not an active participant anymore in the union and in local level politics, although he was tied to it. In fact, he was tied to one of the excisions from the Partido Popular, which came somewhat later because he was part of the network of the mayor, Paco Robledo, was it? Yeah, and Paco Robledo was one of the guys who led an excision from the Popular Party and was thrown out of it a couple of years later. This is all, this is all really these points have to be connected to make sense, both of the interlocutors and of the fieldwork itself, and also of this other issue, which has been raised, of the type of guys who kind of come up in this kind of fieldwork sometimes.
Other questions?
Gracias por un panel fascinante. Tengo una pregunta para Ana Luisa. Ana Luisa, ¿no? Quiero encontrar tu libro o su libro porque en particular me llamó la atención dos cosas. Así que una pregunta que surge de mi propia ignorancia sobre el campo antropológico. Hablaste o mencionaste muy rápido una teoría de Bertold, algo sobre una ventana genealógica, ¿no? ¿Qué pasó?
Probably if you move here, it will be better because you won't have the feedback of the...
Así que no solo... Here, hold.
Come here.
I can talk. I can be heard.
Well, we're recording.
We're recording, yes. Here is okay.
I got the Cuban no from Ada. No.
Now you're too...
Right here. This is great.
Así que solo me podrías repetir el teorista, quizás sea francés, ¿no? Que hable de eso, porque me resulta fascinante, ¿no? Y la lealtad a los informantes después, a las versiones de la genealógica, ¿no? De la familia. Y lo otro fue que lamentaste o notaste dos veces o varias veces la falta de como una interpretación o una teoría emotiva, ¿no? Dentro de discursos o disciplinas sociales, ¿no? En Cuba y bueno, en otros lugares. Así que, ¿cómo planteas tú en el libro esa historia emocional como memoria política? ¿Cómo se desarrolla una metodología dentro de tu libro para hablar de eso? Que me pareció fascinante.
¿Puedo responder ahora? Respecto a la ventana de observación, es una idea, ¿no? Es una idea que permite, pues, utilizar a otras personas que tienen la misma posición genealógica en el lugar de sujetos de la familia que se está estudiando que ya no existen o no están disponibles. Entonces, utilizar las experiencias y los conocimientos de esas personas de la misma generación para reemplazar a los miembros de la familia que no están. Hablé de Daniel Berthaud, es un sociólogo francés que ha trabajado bastante, está muy publicado, más en inglés yo diría que en francés. Él ha estado cerca de algunos proyectos de Paul Thompson y no estoy muy al tanto de sus últimas publicaciones, pero en un momento determinado, por los años 80 y principios de los 90, hace esta propuesta que ha resultado muy útil para trabajos con historias de familia. Lo han aplicado un grupo de investigaciones culturales que tiene la Universidad de Colima en México y ha dado un interesante resultado, y bueno, yo estoy tratando de aplicarlo también porque realmente es una manera de utilizar, ¿no?, los testimonios con el objetivo de construir a partir de versiones individuales, pues, una historia colectiva. Respecto a la segunda pregunta sobre la lealtad con los informantes, fue un problema grave para mí, es decir, una decisión muy difícil. No puedo ni siquiera ahora mismo reproducir los pasos de esa transición o de las sucesivas transiciones, pero voy a mencionar solamente cómo me sentí primero respecto a esto, y me sentí como una impostora que va allí a un lugar donde la gente en un momento determinado está viviendo mal y está sufriendo las consecuencias de un cambio muy brusco, y yo voy allí a disfrutar, y le pongo unas comillas a la palabra disfrutar, de esos malestares para sacar de allí mi libro. Me sentí realmente muy mal y tuve que buscar algunas compensaciones internas para poder seguir trabajando con este problema, porque si me quedo ahí no hubiera podido hacer nada, es decir, no hubiera podido llevar a cabo un libro que yo creo que al final resulta respetuoso hacia mi propia posición como investigadora de la cultura y hacia las personas que me contaron sus historias. Pero el libro no está todavía en la calle, va a salir para febrero, marzo, abril, y ellos me dirán después si realmente el trabajo de estilo que hice, porque es un trabajo que reescribí muchas veces hasta estar bastante satisfecha con el resultado final, que es el que tengo ahora mismo, que se terminó de editar, realmente, está ya en diseño. Siempre quedan cosas con las que hubiera preferido pues no estar, pero ya ese es el resultado final y ellos serán los que dirán la última palabra. En cuanto a la ausencia de emoción de las ciencias sociales cubanas, yo creo que tiene en su origen la falta de una disciplina, de una academia, es decir, el espacio que queda en las disciplinas sociales y que no ha sido cubierto por los estudios de antropología. No tenemos una escuela de antropología cubana. Hay algunos científicos sociales que tienen una inclinación, una visión antropológica, como a veces le llamamos, y se han hecho esfuerzos para abrir la disciplina, pero la disciplina no está. Entonces, la falta de la visión antropológica es lo que, a mi juicio, hace que las generaciones que están hoy mismo en la academia no estén preparados para dar valor a los aspectos del mundo simbólico de los sujetos con que se trabaja. Entonces resultan sus interpretaciones muy lúcidas desde el punto de vista histórico o desde el punto de vista sociológico, muy encajadas, muy bien encajadas desde el punto de vista político, pero absolutamente ciegos para lo que es el plano sentimental de los sujetos del cambio social.
Okay, other questions? Yes, Anasa. Yeah.
This question is about the Manolo Papers. A lot of history written on Cuba, especially in the United States, tends to be city-centric, especially Havana-centric, for understandable reasons. And I'm just wondering how maybe the Manolo Papers can be used to understand, I guess, how people, like literally in the middle of Cuba, away from the cities, kind of responded to national politics.
I mean, I guess your assessment is right. I mean, even within Cuba is Havana-centric, many of the history, and these papers in particular are very rich in terms of sort of changing that. I mean, that being said, there has been a real strong movement in probably over a decade now of regional history. There have been workshops going on regional history in Santa Clara for quite a long time, and they go every 2 years. If any of you is interested in going to give a paper there, and Hernán Venegas Delgado is one of the leading scholars in sort of working regional history. He has a book called La Historia, La Región en Cuba, or the region in Cuba, and he's actually collaborating with me in this project. So they will have plenty of information in terms of Mayahigua in particular, but also I think Olivia mentioned Esmeralda. Like, I mean, Manolo was writing about Mayahigua, but he also wrote about places that were important for him. And there are times that Withers is sort of trying to say, no, I'm interested in Mayahigua. He wants to write about other places. But also in terms of the photographs, those of you, I mean, there's a growing interest now in visual anthropology and how we can read images. The photographs are not exclusively of Mayahigua. There are photographs of Camagüey or Trinidad or Baracoa, other places that you can sort of look at them and see, what there is there to analyze. But we have to learn to read photographs, which is a different kind of reading. But they are there. I mean, some of them are going to be digitized, hopefully soon, and that will help dissemination. But they're certainly important.
I think there was another question, Pamela in the back.
Yo quería preguntar a la compañera, este papel que mostraste de la propiedad privada me fascinó. Y yo no sé si podrías darnos más detalle de una genealogía del imaginario sobre la propiedad privada ahí en todo este contexto de cambios, de entrecruces, de regresiones de migración, etcétera, etcétera. Y a todos los paneles, incluido a Sidney, yo quisiera preguntarles ¿cómo están problematizando esta noción de informante? Porque yo creo que los informantes ahora en este mundo contemporáneo de la antropología de mi país, por ejemplo, en Bolivia, ya no hay muchos informantes. Los informantes se han convertido en antropólogos. Entonces, como que, ¿qué se hace con eso, no? Un poco eso. Gracias.
Yeah. What I was trying to do using archival material was just to take in seriously this task of looking at informant as if ethnographers. But I've tried to isolate all the information, for instance, Jorge amassed about Manolo and all the context we now know about the world in which Manolo has lived. So if we take Manolo as an ethnographer, what kind of anthropology Manolo has made? This is a very important question because anthropology currently is facing a challenging in considering hardly the role of asymmetry and how we can challenge this idea of asymmetry if not taken seriously the way people want to talk about themselves, not just what they talk about themselves, but the way they prefer to talk about themselves. I think our task is taking seriously this as a part of our work as anthropologists.
I guess, I mean, if I could probably add, I mean, in this particular case, I mean, both were, in a way, informants, like if we compare Tasso and Manolo, but they were informant in very different ways, and in terms of the way they provided the information to the anthropologist. And so in that sense, it's sort of to put one, even to put the category informant as if it were one and only one way to be an informant, that would be problematic. I mean, you have in Sid's and Tasso's case, I mean, you have, I mean, one of the things that happens with that book is Sid speaking first about his subject position even before all the postmodern people were speaking about it. And he's saying, you know, this is where I come from and this is where I arrived. And the kind of empathy that evolved of all these conversations face to face. In case of Manolo and Withers, it's not all the time face to face, it's in writing. I mean, to the extent that he sent all these reports that were page by page. Basically, he followed the same system that he had used in Plainville, USA, which he wrote under the name of James West, of like, you know, tell me what happened. And then basically Manolo would write what happened today, and he would write a page, and that would be sent by post to Withers. And then he would be amassing them, and he never did, and I mean, he scribbled on them. But it's not the kind of same relation of information. Even Manolo doesn't realize how much he wrote. I mean, when I met him in 2008, you know, it was a very wonderful experience. And after we talked, he was very, very kind in terms of the time he gave to us. I said, do you realize how much you wrote? And then he said, no, you know, I was sending these reports. And I said, well, you wrote like more than, you know, 1,500 pages. And he sort of said in a very Cuban way, oye, escribí. He sort of said like, so it's I think we can think about this relation of informants. So I think we cannot just think that there's only one informant and one way to be an informant or one way to be an anthropologist and an ethnographer. So the symmetry of the relation is not necessarily the same all the time. So it's important to take that into account.
Yo no podría hablar de informantes. Realmente me informaron, pero para encontrar mi postura, esa que me iba a permitir dialogar con ellos, tuve que bajar mis expectativas, convertirme en una persona diferente, pero sin sentirme que estaba representando un personaje. Fue una transición interna interesante y que llevó un tiempo, ¿no? Desde luego que me informaron tanto que me hablaban de cosas que yo no podía entender, porque no tenía el más mínimo conocimiento sobre los problemas de la agricultura, sobre las variedades de caña, sobre el nombre de los equipos de la fábrica, pues un montón de cosas que tuve que estudiar por los libros después, para saber de qué me estaban hablando. Recogí absolutamente todo lo que me contaban con una grabadora, lo transcribí absolutamente todo. Y después algunas cosas las tuve que dejar, porque cuando les preguntaba para que me dieran una explicación más comprensible para mí, era más enredado todavía, porque no lo podían explicar de la manera en que yo lo podía entender. Entonces hubo cosas que tuve que abandonar en relación con ciertos procedimientos de trabajo agrícola y cosas así. Absolutamente. Tampoco tuve demasiados sujetos, tampoco trabajé con tantos sujetos como para lograr varias explicaciones sobre esos procesos productivos que me permitieran entender lo que me estaban tratando de decir. Entonces, de entrada, no uso el término informante, sino sujeto. El libro, creo que esa es la palabra que más veces se puede encontrar en el libro, sujeto. Estoy todo el tiempo, los tengo sentados en mi memoria. Cuando escribo, los tenía sentados como un público esperando a ver qué voy a decir y cómo lo voy a decir. Entonces fue muy difícil escribir así, con tanta gente mirando lo que estaba haciendo. Con relación al tema del documento, con una interpretación desde el punto de vista simbólico, ¿no? No quiero adelantar conclusiones de ninguna clase porque no hice un estudio del problema de la propiedad tal como se plantea para ellos. Lo que voy a decir es de una impresión muy básica. Ellos no están defendiendo mucho el derecho a ser los propietarios de la tierra. Esta no es una población asentada por siglos en esa tierra, es una población de origen inmigrante y por lo tanto es una población relativamente reciente que llegó allí más o menos a principios del siglo XX, más o menos en la década del 20. La tierra no era suya, la tierra la había comprado el dueño del central. Se picó, se separó en parcelas de más o menos 3 caballerías y esas 3 caballerías eran lo que se le contrataba a los colonos individuales para que produjeran caña con su familia, con fuerza de trabajo familiar. Así estuvieron con un sistema que era muy rígido porque era solo contra el contrato inicial que había hecho el padre de familia. El padre envejeció, murió y los hijos se quedaron, todo esto antes del año 59, se quedaron trabajando en la misma forma, sin hacer ningún tipo de división de la tierra, hasta la reforma agraria del año 60. Con la reforma agraria había 2 hermanos que tenían discrepancias entre ellos y cada uno cogió su pedazo. Hubo uno que decidió formalizar su pedazo y recibió un documento de propiedad del Instituto de Reforma Agraria por ese pedazo, ese era su pedazo. Y el otro, pues, se quedó con la otra parte, pero nunca le interesó tener ese documento de propiedad emitido por el gobierno revolucionario. Esa es la colonia que se pierde. Es decir, que se venden los últimos pedazos a la cooperativa, a una cooperativa en el año 63. Es decir, este es un caso, pero el caso de este otro campesino que sí compró, que compró en los años 50, compró con su dinero, un dinero que su padre le había dado y un dinero que se ganó en la lotería, No, ya voy a terminar. Este sí tiene sentido de propietario y a ese nadie le discute su derecho de propiedad. Pero el gobierno, el Estado, lo que está fomentando ahora es colonias de otro tipo que no van por el camino de entregar títulos de propiedad, sino entregar contratos, hacer contratos de usufructo. Y en última instancia, el contrato de usufructo, que es lo que el Estado promueve, representa un conflicto para los nuevos productores, porque ellos necesitan hacer una inversión inicial, porque estas tierras están perdidas, están muy mal atendidas desde que se quitó la caña, y en la misma medida en que tienen que invertir dinero, tienen que haber conseguido el dinero y no quieren perder su dinero. Y como son tierras del Estado, ya sucedieron otros procesos que no es el momento de contar, sienten ciertamente algo inseguros respecto a las decisiones que el Estado pueda tomar posteriormente con relación a esas tierras que ahora les contratan a ellos porque son contratos por tiempo limitado. Esa es la...
I'm going to exercise my prerogative as chair. Sid, did you have a question?
I wondered if I might make a brief comment. With regard to the discussion of informants and life histories, the first thing I should say, I suppose, is that at the annual spring meetings of the American Ethnological Society in Puerto Rico last spring, a session had been organized, and Seidel Silverman, Eric Wolf's widow, had been asked to arrange it. And it was devoted to the book, The People of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rico Project. And I've heard the papers then and have read some of them. And I think they will be interesting to people when they appear, which should be quite soon. The second thing in regard to this, I wrote a paper about 15 years ago that was called The Sensation of Moving While Standing Still. And it was my take on one aspect of postmodernity, because when I was a student 70 years ago now, at that time, anthropology was in its scientific phase. And informants were small bugs that you put on a slide and under a microscope, and you viewed them in the cold, valueless, scientifically important way that we understand human behavior. Well, at the time, this seemed to me like a pile of crap, and I did try to write bringing subject and informant and ethnographer together, though hesitantly and with fright. And at the time that the book appeared, several of the reviews said that it would have been a good book if I hadn't been friendly to my informant, which struck me as very interesting and surreal. Well, 70 years have passed, and this pendulum has now swung to the other end. And now that it's at the other end, we're brutes, imperialistic brutes who brutalize our informants, and they're delicate and sensitive, and we pin them up against the wall. And so in order to make up for that, we must instead love them. So the pendulum has now gone all the way over to the other side, and believe me, if you are lucky like I am and live to be as old as I am, it'll be back at the other end. My mother used to say, if you put all of your old clothes in a barrel, and when it's full, you turn it upside down, you'll be back in style. So don't get too caught up in this problem. Anthropology is the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the sciences, and it's a good thing to remember. We're lucky to be in a discipline like that. So a final thing I wanted to say was that I didn't undertake to work with Tasso until 3 years after I had studied the community he lived in. And so he was not someone I had just met. He was someone whom I'd known a long time. And I worked under these circumstances at an enormous advantage. Starting with a life history is much more difficult, both for the informant and, I think, for the ethnographer. And so the two things we're discussing Picabia on the one hand, Manolo on the one hand, and Tasso on the other. Though I think comparisons are very, very productive, we have to keep in mind, I think, the different circumstances in which they were written.
Great. Well, I think there are probably more questions out there, but we are a little bit over time, and there's lunch waiting outside. So we'll stop. There's lunch, and then we'll continue with the Puerto Rico panel and the Trinidad panel. Thank you.